Alrighty, welcome to Cocktails and Fishtales. It's our final presentation of 2020, and we're super excited to be featuring Julie from UW to talk about microplastics with us tonight. But before we get to that, of course, if you could chime in where you're tuning in from, we'd love to know where this is reaching because, right, we're bringing science, social, online with you here in your living room, wherever you may be. So we're excited to have you. We're excited for this presentation. But before we turn it over to Julie, I have a couple just little announcements to go over. First of all, you've probably noticed that all over the Harbor WildWatch social media feed, we have been talking all salmon all the time because it is fall, it is rainy, but don't despair. All that rain is filling up the creeks and it's happy salmon weather. So we've been seeing all sorts of chum salmon returning to local creeks here. We've gone to Chico Creek out by Bremerton. So if you missed that peak, you can always tune into some of our videos that are posted after the fact. We've started doing our Donkey Creek virtual salmon tours. So part 1 happened last Saturday, and we'll be doing part 2 and part 3, these 2 upcoming Saturdays. And of course, we have one more Friday fish check out at Minter Creek this Friday. So if you'd like to join virtually, we'll be featuring more salmon all throughout the end of November. And of course, it's a great time to just get out and go to the creek yourself. So if you haven't been out to Donkey Creek or any of your local waterways, go for a stroll and see if you can find some salmon. And if you're at Donkey Creek, add your observations to the salmon observation station that we have installed under the bridge. That's kind of a fun way to do some community science with us to figure out great fish viewing times. So lots of salmon, lots of good stuff. I'm gonna just check my notes for any other things. Yeah, I think that's my initial announcements before I turn it over to you, Julie. I have a couple more announcements at the end as we gear up for 2021 and all of our fun December programs and on into that. So with no further ado, I'm gonna let Julie share her screen and we're gonna spotlight her and her presentation. So I have a sweet little intro for you though. So let me pull that up.
You need to give me hosting again. Sorry.
Yeah, we'll get you unmuted, we'll get you good to go. We're definitely excited to have you here to talk about your research on microplastics. We know that Julie's fieldwork with undergraduates at UW focuses on determining the concentrations of microplastics in the waters of the Pacific Northwest. She involves several students in her research work, as well as partners with many environmental education groups throughout the region. I know I actually first heard her present on microplastics at a Surfrider meeting all the way back in, I think it was January 2014. So I'm personally very excited about this update. So with that, Julie, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you. I remember I logged in. I need to be co-host again. Sorry.
Oh, right. Yeah. Let's get you all squared away. The adventures of technology.
All set. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a long time coming. Let me tell you, we've been working together trying to find a time, and it's finally arrived today. So I'm really excited to be here today. So as was mentioned, my name is Julie Masura. I'm an associate teaching professor at the University of Washington Tacoma. And I'm going to be talking about the work that we've been doing at the University of Washington Tacoma since 2008. So it's been a long time. We've done this for over 12 years. The title of my talk is Microplastics Among Us, but really this has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with the collaborations that I have with several regional organizations, as well as a number of just really highly dedicated undergraduate students and graduate students who did this as a part of their research project for their major program. So normally we would do this, of course, in a pub, right? And that would have been super fun. And then we would talk about stuff. And unfortunately, because of the way that this is being delivered, we really don't have an opportunity to do that. But what I want you guys to do before I even begin the formal talk is I want you to think about how do you know something that you're looking at is plastic? Just think about that for just a moment. And then what are some of the physical properties of plastic? Is plastic hard? Is plastic soft? Is plastic red? Is it brown? Is it green? What are, can you stretch plastic and it can retain its elasticity? Or when you stretch plastic, does it actually stay stretched out, right? And so plastic has so many properties, and applying this and trying to understand the properties of plastics are where we begin this story about how we monitor plastics in the environment. So why the University of Washington Tacoma? Well, in 2008, we hosted the very first plastic marine debris workshop. And then 3 years later, we hosted the second one in Tacoma. We've engaged in over 40 undergraduate and graduate research students in their primary research projects. And we partnered with over 20 local, national, and international groups with the concern of trying to understand microplastic pollution in the world's ocean focus. So at the first international research workshop on plastic debris, what we're looking for is like, what do we know and what didn't we know? And from that workshop, we came out with the original working definition of microplastics. It's anything that's less than 5 millimeters that is primarily composed of synthetic polymers. So 5 millimeters came out of that meeting, although it had been used many, many different times, and there was a lot of other definitions. So really, from this workshop, we were really trying to determine, is it really a problem in the environment, or is it just kind of a labile kind of a material? And so we were looking at impacts on organisms, exposures, the effect on biogeochemical cycles. And what was discovered at this meeting, and you can see all the people that were there, is that really there was no standard method of collecting water or shore material, and nor were the lab methods the same. And it's something that we struggle with still today. At the second marine debris workshop, which happened 3 years later, this was focused more on assessing what the risks were of microplastics in the ocean, and also, again, looking at standardizing practice, which is still a struggle that we are involved in today. So for today, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things. So here's my outline. I'm going to talk about plastic pollution. And when I started talking about this in 2008 and even through even 2014, when I last spoke, a lot of people didn't really understand, really the impacts of plastic pollution. It was still kind of its infancy. But I think now more and more people are pretty aware of the plastic pollution problem. I'm going to discuss the field methods that we use, how we actually sample some of the materials that we process in the laboratory, and we try to analyze and determine the concentrations. And then finally, I'll show you some Puget Sound results. And if we have some time at the end, I'd love to talk about the work that I've done on Vancouver Island, and also talk a little bit about ways in which we can reduce plastic pollution in the ocean. I shouldn't say we, or you, but you and me for we. So here is a slide that I've been using since I started talking about my research. And this is a picture of, we can see on this slide, some seagrass. That's cool. And we see a coconut. In fact, I see 2 coconuts. But what was really disturbing is starting to see a Ziploc bag. And as you continue to look at this picture, we see a paper or a potato chip bag. We see plastic bottles that probably had bleach or some sort of a cleaner that's actually broken up into smaller pieces. So here's an old remnants of a plastic bottle. Here's some plastic bottles, lots of Ziploc bags. And so what used to be floating mats of seaweeds and boda seeds, and even maybe a tree or a log or two, has really started to incorporate human trash, anthropogenic inputs that are found in patches throughout the world's ocean, and actually in all of our water bodies. So recently, NOAA kind of updated some of their slides and some of their text and their pictures. And I just wanted to show this picture because I think this picture is really important, is to really show, okay, so what's happening with plastic pollution? Where is it coming from? And on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll actually see there's basically land-based input of plastics into the ocean. There's a bunch of cars that are driving on the roads whose rubber tires are breaking down and basically floating back into the ocean. We see trash that's put in a proper trash cans, but if the trash cans are full, trash falls out, the wind's going to pick it up and bring it into the ocean. There's this girl who isn't having a great time with her balloons, and yet they get released, and of course they eventually lose their buoyancy and will end up in some sort of a catchment or a basin, and has the potential to eventually make its way into the ocean. There's the blue squiggly line that shows any kind of a waterway can actually be a filtrate or actually be a kind of a venue or a freeway to get these plastic pollution to the ocean. The one thing we can say about plastic pollution with respect to all other pollution types is that plastic pollution is definitely the source is from man, period. There's no other explanation. It comes from us. It's our solid waste that's making into the ocean environment. If we look in the center of this slide, we actually see a really cool graphic that shows how microplastics are created. There's two types, and I'll go into detail, but microplastics oftentimes are breaking down from larger pieces of plastic. It can be done through mechanical manipulation, so waves and battering on the shorelines, etc., or even the sun can actually photodegrade polymers and cause them to break, become brittle, and then eventually will become, of course, these plastics. As we look in kind of just to the left of the yellow microplastics bottle, we see this kind of whirlpool of plastic in smaller and smaller pieces. And so what we're finding is that there's ingestion of plastics on all trophic levels, from plankton all the way up to, unfortunately, our largest mammals, the whales. On the very left-hand side, which I'm going to repeat at the end, is some of the commonly found plastics that are found from beach cleanup. So there's the International Beach Cleanup that happens on Earth Day, and they count up all the material that they see. And this is what's actually on the shoreline. So imagine what's on the bottom of the ocean. Cigarette butts, 2 million, bottle caps, plastic straws, paper cups, plastic cup holders, single-use plastic bags, and beverage bottles, and of course, a number of food wrappers. And these are found all over the world. It's not just here in the United States, not just here in Washington State, but all over the world. These are very common plastics that unfortunately you and I probably have already seen on our ocean beaches, or on our Puget Sound beaches. So let's look a little bit about how plastics kind of get incorporated and kind of interacts with the environment. So the source is always going to come from land. Although there's a sea source as we are bringing our ships across the ocean, there's unintentional debris. And then there's also a land source that, again, could be intentional or unintentional littering that plastics get into the ocean. When they're out in the ocean, they can become weathered, they break down. Okay. And then anything that's in water, especially if they're in the environment, it starts to become, as an old colleague of mine said, real estate for other organisms to grow on. So you have these plastic pellets, and all of a sudden you start getting the slimy green stuff kind of growing on top. It's going to become a little bit denser and a little bit denser and a little bit denser, and makes its way to the ocean floor. And it interacts with different trophic levels of organisms. In the center here, we see plastics that leach from, or excuse me, chemicals that leach from plastics. Plastics, in order for them to have these interesting physical properties, they have to have plasticizers and other chemical and additives added, which can eventually leach out into the ocean. And now you have these emerging contaminants. Critters are swimming around the ocean. Maybe the plastic isn't going to give them the direct pollutant, but because of this chemical that leached out of the plastic, and they're swimming around in it, that could be another source for interacting with organisms. And so this comes, and then also plastics get into the ocean, and those pollutants can then absorb or stick to the outside of plastic. So think about, although nobody does this anymore, so hopefully this will land somewhere, think about washing your dishes and having really greasy dishes, and then you wash a plastic dish after, you have this really dirty dishwater. It sticks to it. It gets really, really greasy. And that's what, plastic does the same thing in the oceans. And then the last one, which I think is kind of interesting and kind of gross at the same time, of course, is the ingestion of plastic. So anytime that an organism will ingest something, it creates a pellet, and it's going to basically create waste. And now that pellet is dense, and it's going to make its way, of course, down to the bottom of the ocean. And now we're starting to affect benthic organisms that are down at the bottom of the ocean, who basically eat other organisms' wastes, right? And now we're having this trophic connection at all levels of consumption of plastics. Okay, so that's where we're coming from, and this is why we're really concerned about plastic pollution in all of the environments, whether it's the ocean or rivers up being blown around in the atmosphere, in the ice cores, etc. So our task when we started this in 2008 was to quantify all plastics in all of the ocean. Figure it out. I was pausing for a giggle. Normally when we're actually in the pub and we're doing this, people are like, what? But of course, that really wasn't it. It was really to come up with a series of methods, both field and laboratory methods, to quickly try to help quantify the plastics that we find in environmental samples. So we had to basically, what we did is we actually had a cadre of research scientists, 1 graduate students and 5 undergraduates that sat in a room and said, okay, let's look at this question. And this is what I love about science. Let's look at this question. Let's try to figure out, okay, what can we do? So the first thing we did is we said, okay, what are the most common polymers that are manufactured and consumed or used by consumers in the whole entire world? And we came up with 3. It's the polyethylene, which is the PE on this chart, polypropylene, which is the PP on this chart, and polyvinyl chloride or PVC pipe, right? So those are the 3 most common. So we focused these standardization of these laboratory methods and field methods to look at these 3 polymers. There are many more. There's pages and pages, and there's volumes of different types of plastics. And this doesn't even include like rubber, or tires. So these are the most common. And then we said, okay, so what's the most common medium in the world? And that's water. And water, if you're at ambient air temperature, so normal or ambient air pressure and ambient air temperature, has the density of 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Okay, that's common. Everybody knows that. And if you don't know it now, you know it, right? So when we looked at the density of all 3 of these very common polymers, we saw that, okay, polyethylene is going to float, polypropylene is going to float, PVC doesn't float, although we find it in the surface waters. So note that we were actually exploring this research in salt water and the sea. And so the density is going to be a little bit greater. And then we start to incorporate movements, tides and currents and wind and flooding events. And now we can see that, PVC can be found in the surface waters. And that was our focus at first. Notice that all of these polymers have very low melting points. So they melt. If we actually took a torch, we have to get up to 135 degrees Celsius to melt polyethylene. Okay, water boils at 100, right? So if we look at these melting temperatures, they're actually greater than what we would commonly find in the environment, especially the ocean environment, unless we're near the underwater volcanoes, of course. But for the most part, we don't reach these temperatures, but that gives them the ability to be able to be malleable and shaped, like my brand new pair of glasses are completely plastic, right? And so plastic was used to kind of replace some of our natural materials for many different things, making, like I said, my glasses or the computer keys, etc., on my computer. Okay. So then the third thing is because it has such a low melting temperature and won't reach those melting temperatures that are stable at environmental temperatures, they have really low reactivity. Okay, which means they're durable. When plastic gets into the environment, it's going to last a long time. How long is very dependent on many different things, but it is durable and it's made to kind of last for a very, very, very long time. Okay, so that's what we came into. So then we took that question, okay, quantify all plastic. No, we're just going to look at certain types of plastics that are in the ocean. Okay, polyethylene bags, polypropylene textiles, your fleeces and stuff, polyvinyl chloride. Okay, we also had to add polystyrene, which probably shouldn't be a surprise to you, but it was something that we're like, we got to do it, because every time I would go out and sample, we'd get polystyrene. Now, the actual polymer of styrene has a density that's greater than 1.0 grams per cubic centimeter, but it has a lot of holes in it, right? And so since it has a lot of holes in it, it's actually quite buoyant, and it's very prevalent in the ocean environment. So we're looking for 4 polymers now as we're developing these methods. Now, during the first international conference, this group borrowed 2 terms that are typically used when we're talking about air pollutants, is primary and secondary. So like a primary air pollutant would be like sulfur dioxide, and a secondary air pollutant, if you had that and it attached to water, it becomes sulfuric acid, right? So that's when it gets released in the environment as in its original state, and then it alters. So we use that same term to describe 2 types of plastic conditions. One that's a primary plastic, one that was manufactured to be that size and hasn't changed, hasn't broken down. Okay, and what we see in this picture, we see a picture of a bunch of little pellets. These are called officially the pre-production plastic pellets. They're like the raw material of any plastic item that you possibly would use. Sometimes you hear these they're called sometimes nurdles. I like to use the term nurdle because I think it's fun to say, but it's truly a pre-production plastic pellet. I've also heard them called mermaid tears. And I was just out in Clay Lock a couple of months ago for a quick little vacation, and all along the strand line, the high tide line from the night before, I found tons and tons and tons and tons of these nurdles. So we see them quite a bit on our beaches, both on the outer beaches and within Puget Sound or the Salish Sea. Secondary plastics are those that break down from primary plastic. So they just break down and degrade and get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay. So we split up plastics into a series of size categories, those that are greater than 100 millimeters. And I just, for lay purposes, anything that's bigger than the palm of your hand. Macroplastics, I'm just trying to find a pen. Oh, I just had one. It rolled under my desk. Sorry, guys. Macroplastics is anything from the palm of your hand to the width of a pen, okay, a skinny pen or a pencil. Microplastics, which is the work that I look at, or the sizes that I look at, is anything from the width of a pencil to the width of a pin. That's actually the size of the mesh of the net that I use to collect most of my samples. And then nanoplastics would be anything that would be smaller than the size of a pin, a straight pin. And that's what those would be nanoplastics. So our task kind of changed a little bit, is to quantify certain types of plastics in specific locations in the ocean. Okay, that could include the water column, okay, the sea floor, and also in beach sediments. So plastic pollution, if we look at the amount of plastic pollution that's in the world, this came from 2019. So last year, 348 million tons of plastic was manufactured in 2017. The estimated yearly ocean plastic pollution is about 9.5 million tons. So approximately all the 3% of that plastic pollution is 9.5 million tons. And so 97% is going to be like in landfills or in different places besides the ocean, but there's a lot of material that goes into the ocean each year. Okay. With primary plastics, when we have primary and secondary plastics, they're about 50-50 when you look at the research. So primary plastics could be tires and dust coming from cities and of fibers, road markings, just those little plastic reflectors that are in their paint, marine coatings, personal care products, the plastic pellets I showed, and synthetic textiles. So it's still again about 50%. So 50% comes from land, 50% comes from ocean vessels that will put plastic pollution in the ocean. The land sources again are stormwater runoff. I was walking my dog yesterday and I noticed in the middle of the busy road, there was a whole bunch of pine needles from, basically the road flooded. And in those pine needles was actually filled with plastic trash or just general trash, Other sources, wastewater treatment plants can, and yet they actually have really great filtration if they're greater than primary treatment. And then atmospheric deposition. It could be macro, like we see in this picture here. We have plastic bags. It seems inevitable. Every time I go to a talk, I see a plastic bag either hanging in a tree or it flies out of a car or something. But, wind is a really a good source, or I don't know if it's a good source, but is another source of plastic pollution on a macro scale, but even on a micro scale. So we're finding plastic fibers and things up in the Arctic, right? We see it down in Antarctica. We see it up in the Rocky Mountains. So definitely atmospheric deposition is another source for plastic pollution. Okay. So I want to talk about the fun stuff, the stuff that really gets students involved, and that's going to be the field work, because everybody likes to go out on boats. So here's a picture of the Theophos waterway. And if you look down at the very bottom of the screen, if it shows you, you're actually going to see me sampling on a little boat, and dragging behind it is this manta net, or this net that we use to capture environmental samples, especially looking for plastic pollution. A friend of mine was in Tacoma walking across the 11th Street Bridge downtown Tacoma at 7 o'clock in the morning, and she's like, oh, there's Julie, and she took this picture. It's my favorite picture. So you might think, well, why are you going so early in the morning? Well, the sea state here in the Puget Sound and in most places is the quietest at the moment. So, in the morning, earliest in the morning. As soon as the sun comes out, then you start kind of churning up, and then the winds start to pick up. And if you're sailors or you do anything on the water, by the afternoon, it can get quite blustery, and that will mix the plastics or anything that's floating on the water into the water column. So there's a picture of me sampling with my friend Dave Thorson from the University of Washington. So there's 3 ways in which we approach our field sampling. For the water, on the upper left-hand picture, we have a picture of a manta net close up. I do note that there is a polypropylene line on the top of this net. This was actually a net that was borrowed. And this researcher asked to borrow my net and take it up to Glacier Bay. So this is a Glacier Bay sample. And you notice he's actually rinsing off the net. And what he's rinsing off the net, it's not plastic, okay? It's not dirt. It's actually diatoms, which are plankton. So he actually those are probably really smelly, stinky samples, but these filled with diatoms, and then you catch it into the cod end or the cup at the end, and then you bring it back to the lab for sampling. In the upper right-hand corner, we have a picture of a former student, Tina Ritval. She's on West Seattle. She lived in West Seattle and actually was on the beach there in Alki doing some sampling for her research project. And you can see there in her hand, she has a plain old food sieve, a really fine mesh food sieve. So when we're doing outreach and we're doing beach plastic sampling and trying to analyze beach sediments, we actually use a fry basket, like what you would use in a restaurant quality fry basket. That's about the mesh there between those, the metal mesh is about 5 millimeters, and the fine sieve is about 1 millimeter. So we actually do some sampling using just this kind of material so that anyone, community scientists, can become involved and try to kind of collect data and try to understand plastic pollution on our beaches. And then the bottom picture here are 2 research scientists from the Department of Ecology, and they're collecting sediment from the bottom of the Salish Sea using what we call a Van Veen. It's just basically a scooper that comes down to the bottom of the ocean. It brings up this nice package of sediment. And then we are actually honored to receive little subsamples of these to check for plastic, and I also do other research with that mud. So I'm going to focus in on the water work that we do. This is something we've been doing for years and probably I have the most data for is looking at water. So when we're using that manta net, which you see on the right-hand side there, it collects in about 15 minutes, 80,000 to 150,000 liters of water. It's a lot of water that goes through there. So we use high volumes of water to come up with the plastic results that I'm going to be showing you in a bit. We bring those samples onto the ship, and here in the middle, early in the morning, this is Clayoquot Sound from the west coast of Vancouver Island, and we're actually sieving through some plastics or some samples here. And then I want you to, now everybody kind of get a little bit closer to your computer, but I want you to see this little white piece or some plastic, right? And then you got some blue pieces. And notice up in the corner here, you guys see in my arrow or my cursor, okay? Here we're starting to see these gray little circular pieces. These are those nurdles, thank you, nurdles from the pre-production plastic pellets. So we have a lot of these nurdles. We not only find them on beaches, but we also find them floating in the water also. And how they get there is a whole nother talk. So please invite me back and I'll talk to you about how plastics can get into the ocean. And then here is just a jar of a sample that's in the lab, okay? So I'm going to continue talking about the water and how we process the water. And we do it a little bit different processing for the sediments from the bottom of the Puget Sound and also the beach sediments. But they always end with these steps. So before I begin talking about how we analyze these samples and try to prepare them for analysis, I want to talk about the 4 different jars of samples from the environment that came into the lab on the left-hand side of the slide. Okay, so notice that we have 4 different jars. They're totally different samples, but they were taken from the exact same day at the exact same location at different times. And so what I'm trying to show you here is that there's high variability of samples when you go into any place in an ocean or even a water environment. Why? Wind, currents, tide, rain events, okay? Or even maybe someone's just cleaning their driveway, right? Or cleaning the streets, right? So here we see there's a high variability. And so I think that what's really important in this research is that you take a lot of samples at different times. And that's pretty typical for ocean research. So what do? We bring them back into the laboratory. We rinse them off through the same sieving process between a 5 millimeter and a 330 micron sieve. And then we place them in jars and we let them dry out. So what we're trying to determine is what is the mass of the solid material, okay? Because as you can see here, looking at all of these, if we took the same exact volume, the amount of solid material varies, right? And that doesn't preclude, there's no correlation between the amount of solids in plastics or the amount of water in plastics. So this is really important. So we get a dry mass, okay? And then what's left is a lot of natural organic material. And even on top of the plastics, remember they get coated with all the green slimy stuff. We actually put it through a wet peroxide oxidation step. And then once that's done and it's completely reacted, then we put it in these glass sieves. And before we do that, we add some salt to it, as much salt as the solution will take so that it has a higher density. So the plastic polymers will actually float at the top. And then we drain them through these little sieves, little PVC pipes that we glue some of the mesh size that's 330 microns in size. And then we pick. And here's the cool thing, or bad thing or cool thing. It's kind of fun because it's science, but it's bad because we find it. But if it looks like plastic, we find that it is. I mean, people have a really good eye of being able to tell the difference between grass and plastics or any other things, because, you know, plastics were kind of replacing natural materials, right? And so plastics can look like natural materials. And so we picked and picked and picked. And this is actually a really old picture because you can see these are headphones that are wired. And then we place them in these little vials, okay? And this is what we find. that's a penny, right? And this is typical, not always, but this is typically how much plastic we find in our ocean surveys, right? 80,000 to 150,000 liters. And this is what we get. Sometimes we're like, is that all there is? Well, the fact that there is. Now, sometimes, again, there's more, but mostly this is what we're finding when we're looking at the microplastics variation. Okay. Some more pretty pictures. The one on the left was on the webpage of University of Washington. So I think it's just a beautiful picture. But again, shows you the variety and what the plastics would look like. And also for the cursor, since I saw that you can see that, here's some of those fibers, right? So we do see fibers and they get tangled up in here. Now on the right-hand side of this picture, we actually see a tangle of fibers. And these tangle of fibers actually came from sediments. And I like to show this because I can't stand fibers. Fibers are a bane of my existence. They're very hard. If we look at this sieve, 1, 2, 3 squares is 1 millimeter, okay? 3 squares is 1 millimeter. So that's a huge tangle of fibers that my student kind of asked me, she's like, do I have to count them all? I'm like, yeah, you do. So she wasn't very happy. Here, this is a piece of grass, okay? And then these are, I call it just organic schmutz. It's just basically slimy material that kind of stayed around. Okay. So let's talk about the Puget Sound and the Salish Sea and what we found. So it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to do this. And this is through a series of partnerships from many, many groups, from Tacoma Community College, Bellarmine Prep, North Seattle Community College. I've had Gig Harbor High School do some sampling in the past, Seattle Aquarium, the United States Geological Survey's Water Center out of Tacoma, Department of Ecology. C is actually this service education adventures from Whidbey Island, a bunch of teachers and at-risk youth that go out to do marine research. Oregon State University, NOAA's Marine Debris program, Sea Grant through Hawaii. I did some work with seal scat. Boy, was that stinky. Looking at plastic and seal scat. Jason Lee Middle School. I've had the honor to advise a graduate student at the University of the Virgin Islands. And you guys, you know what? I had to go to the Virgin Islands and watch a graduate defense. I can't think of a worse experience. It was kind of cool. And then also NSERC, which is like Canada's NSF. Okay. So I've worked with a couple of graduate students from University of Washington Tacoma's GIS program. And through 3 of these students, they've come up with and built on their projects. So the original student, her project was taken over by another student. And this is kind of the final project that Lindsay Hanna came up with. And this is actually her thesis, her website. But if you scroll down here, she basically does a really nice job. It's about talking about plastics. This is what a plastic sample can look like. Okay, here's a student of mine in the Thea Fawcett's holding up a sample, a freshman. I take them out. I'll talk about that class in a little bit. And then a little bit about how we measure plastics and sampling. And if anybody knows anything about ships, this is from the Clifford Barnes, which has been no longer is with the University Fleet. It's a very sad day. So we're on the Clifford Barnes. That's a couple of years back. A little video that I did for UW 360. And then this map is really what I wanted to show you. And what they came up with using a telephone app, you could actually do field work, put all the field work in there, and then you could click a button and you can see on University of Washington Tacoma, this particular sample collected a sample on 2011, September 11th. And here's the concentration in milligrams per grams. And basically the color and the size of the dot indicates an order of magnitude difference between the amount of plastics that were found. And you can see most of the concentration. I have the great honor to work up and down the west coast of Vancouver Island, and also, of course, throughout the Puget Sound, teaching and doing research. So this is one of the projects that came out of this. Okay. Just to summarize 2010 to 2018. So what we see here, and I'll explain this chart, it's just a dot plot, but I wanted to show you what this means. So down on the x-axis is the dry mass, and we measure that in grams. Okay, so dry mass, all that solid stuff that was basically dried the night after we did the sieving, overnight after we did the sieving. And then over here, this is going to be the concentration of the solid plastics and the solid mass that was in your sample. Okay. And we measure those in milligrams per gram or parts per thousand. Okay. So we take that and divide it by 10, then we get parts per 100, which is what you and I are more familiar with its percentages. Okay. So notice that the different colors represent different years. Okay. Most of these colors are basically accumulate here in the bottom corner. So there's low masses of dry mass or solids. There's low amounts of plastics in those solids. The highest was 25%. We found like a big piece of plastic in there. Everything pretty much plots below 5% of plastics in those solids, and everything's below about 0.7%. When we do a statistical analysis, we don't see that we see an increase or a decrease. It's kind of steady, although the amount of plastic use is actually increased over time. So that's kind of interesting. So since I have a couple more minutes, I just want to kind of blast through some more projects that we've done. So the Department of Ecology has a program called the Puget Sound Ecosystem Monitoring Program. And they basically have been conducting long-term monitoring throughout the Puget Sound in sediments. And just to remind you, they're picking the sediments up using this Van Veen, this sediment scooper that goes down to the bottom of the Puget Sound. And so I've had a student that's been working on this, and she's been able to publish and contribute to the Puget Sound report. And all these colors, red doesn't mean like this is bad, there just means high, and blue means low, and then really dark blue and almost black means none. So if you look at all of these pictures from 2014, and I meant to trade this out for ones that had bigger dots and I just didn't get to it, so I'm so sorry. But if you look from left to right, we go from 2014 to 2019, and notice that the colors are red and orange. We have red and orange. Here we have some yellow, so we actually had a little spike in plastics in places. Okay, here we had our first zero here in Hood Canal. In 2017, we have more yellow, more zero. Here's a zero here down by Olympia, yellows, and then we start oranging up. Now it seems like we have an increase and a decrease in plastics over time, but when we do the statistical analysis, it really doesn't show that it's significant. Okay. All right. So I'll really quickly go through the work that I've done up in Vancouver Island, where we actually go to different communities and teach plastic pollution monitoring. So NSERC again is basically like our NSF. So we have a female team that we are working together and talking about science to the community. So Leslie King, Laura Lux, and Audrey Dallimore are from Vancouver Island. And myself, this is me in the orange hat. This is Julie. And then my colleague, Cheryl Greengrove from the University of Washington Tacoma. And we're actually in a village where you can only get there from boat or plane. And do you guys notice the boat back here? This boat is one of those boats that goes from the Great Canoe, where the native cultures actually get together and they arrive at certain beaches. This has happened in Westport. This has happened in Tacoma. They've been hosted up in Victoria. So this has actually had a lot of paddling, and some of these students here were involved in some of those great paddles. So we were on the Mactusis Beach doing some plastic monitoring, and I want to point out Juniper and Diamond. These guys were awesome. They were so bossy, and they just kept the boys in line and like, come on, let's get some work done. Here's the village that we can see, the Ahosit village that you can see from the water. Here's Lennon and Brandon, and here's Stanley. Lennox buried himself in a hole, but here's the funny thing about Lennox is he would ask a question, he'd be not even paying attention. He would answer the question perfectly. Like, he was so tuned in, he just needed to keep moving. We partnered up with surf riders from a village called Ucluelet. They came out, and instead of doing a beach cleanup like community service, right? They actually did some community science, and they actually did a really cool tally to add to the Oceans Conservancy tallies. So this is the Mactussis High School. Annie Broadhurst was the teacher. 16 students and elders were involved in this program, and they were in it, man. They were working. These two, this is Xavier and David. They were twins. They kept trading sweatshirts and hats, those little silly guys, and they kept trying to trick me, but I caught on. So they sampled some locations in Front Beach, and they continued to do the sampling for their community. Near the town of Tofino, Wickenish Beach is a beach that you can get to from downtown Tofino. Tofino is the last city that you can drive to without driving into the Pacific Ocean. It's a really cool vacation kind of spot. And this is a place where we actually, myself and my colleagues, do research out of this area, looking at harmful algae. That's a whole nother talk. You guys can have me back. But here are the students, and they were fighting over these tweezers, but check this out. See the beach, how clean it is? But once you start looking, they actually found plastic pellets. Okay. And you see these little purple bins, University of Washington, right? We left these bins and these kits with these students so that they could continue to monitor. So this is the Wickenish Community School. The teacher was Melanie Morris. 20 students in Asia from the Rain Coast Education Society also participated in this project. And these guys were cool. I mean, they were so excited and so really, just really tuned in to the work that they were doing. It was great. We collected the data. And then the intention was to share that with our students here in the Puget Sound, and I hope that we can rekindle that program again. So I'm pretty close to nearing the end. So I got just a couple more slides is just to summarize what I just said to you guys. I've been talking the whole time. I wish that we could interact a little bit better. Plastic pollution in the ocean is persistent. We find it everywhere. I used to find it in every sample. I think if we look small enough, we'll find it in every sample. The field and laboratory methods were developed very clearly just to explore large volumes of environmental samples. So, and that's a point of contingency for some folks are like, well, you're not looking at all sizes. That's right. We were looking at, the microplastic range of sizes. The Puget Sound surface water contained plastic that range from 0 to 25% of the solids that have been collected from 2010 to 2018. And we really don't see any significant change in microplastic concentrations from year to year. So here are all the students, so many students, and these are most of them. These are the ones that did research projects. This doesn't include all of the classes that got to participate in some of the sampling. Before I leave you, I want to talk about a really cool program that I cannot wait for this situation that we're in to be over, and that's something called Girls at the Helm. So I actually work with a group called Sound Experience. You may have seen the beautiful ship, the Adventurous. It's actually kind of hanging over here. This is the Adventurous here behind me. We do a trip where we take out girls from probably like middle school to high school. We have an all-girl crew from, and then 3 women scientists, and we take them out and we do this project. And of course, I bring out my students. So I bring out my female identifying students to participate also. And we spend 3 days talking about different things. And one of the rotations is plastic. And so you can see these guys are just all in it. And I make them put on what we call we get them the foulies. We put the raincoat, the rain gears on, and they get in there and they do the processing. And then my students process them back, or they actually do the analysis back in the lab, and they share that with the students later, a few weeks later. So cool program. Here's the initial research team. These are the guys that came up with everything. I didn't do this stuff. I just had the honor to manage and to work with these really fabulous students. I like to end with this slide. This is a science class that I get to teach. It's called Introduction to Science. And what we're trying to do is teach students about science, whether they're going to be a science major or not. But I use microplastics, the question of microplastics, and they explore it with a scientific lens and also a social lens. And so it's pretty cool. So they go out and they sample on a ship, they do the analysis in the lab, and then they finally get to pick out the samples. And they're pretty engaged, they're not sitting back. Although this guy's sitting back because she wanted to look, but he actually, they were super enthused about the work that they did. And now these guys are all graduated and doctors and actors and stuff. So it's pretty cool. Okay. I want to just say, I think sometimes we talk about this issue, and I want to just say, what can you do? So you can lead a community cleanup. Uh, and there's a link here. If you just go to NOAA's webpage, this came from them. You can model your behavior. So looking at the 10 items, the top 10 items that were collected at the beach cleanups on, what's it called? Earth Day, cigarette butts, plastic bottles, you can see all of these things. These are the top 10 things that are found on beaches. And it's something, again, that you and I can prevent from getting onto the beaches and into the ocean if we just learn how to use less or use none, or make sure it gets into the proper waste receptacle. You can create a sharing economy. And then you can also contact your regional marine debris coordinator. And that's Andrew Mason. He just got here. I think he's been here maybe for a year and a half. But he's super thrilled about his new job here in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm sure would love to partner up with any of your groups. So that's all I have today. I'm going to leave this slide up. But if you guys have any questions, yeah, let's do it.
We definitely have lots of questions and lots of love coming your way, Julie. Thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. Yes, now you're done with the presentation. You can cheers your beverage.
So I opened a beer accidentally before I started, and I was like, what am I doing? But now cheers to you guys.
Yes, it is Cocktails and Fishtales. So cheers indeed. I know I wore my little nurdle ring for the occasion, and now I cannot stop thinking about how they're called mermaid tears. So yeah. We'll be referring to them as that. But looking at the Facebook chat, I am going to go through, and we have a lot of great questions. And of course, as we start going through these questions, for those of you who are tuning in, if you want to chime in with some more questions, we'll be answering those live until they dwindle out and we wrap up for the evening. So our first question comes from Emily, and she's wondering, are PE, PP, and PVC mostly inputs from recyclable plastics or mostly single-use non-recyclables? And is the source determinable?
Yeah, on the microplastic scale, I can't tell. I cannot tell. And I read a lot of stuff. And so that would definitely be something that a macroplastic beach kind of cleanup expert. But when we look at here, you can look at, these are the top 10, right? Here's your plastic bag. So there's your propylene. And, so this could be polyethylene. So yeah, I don't know exactly which one is coming from recyclable or reused or whatever, single use. I don't know. Yeah.
Good question, Emily.
Yes.
All right. Lynn is out there wondering, she says, it seems like the plastic problem has been well known and promoted for many years now. Have you seen any measurable reduction in the ocean pollution?
No. When we look at the manufacturing, we're finding that we're making more, we're using more. When we look at the environmental concentrations, from my work that I've done and for most of the work, we're seeing that it's still about the same, which here's the issue. So where is it going? So there's a sink somewhere. And so kind of within the last couple of years, people have been going down to the bottom of the ocean and they're seeing trash, fields, right? So yeah, it hasn't been clearly quantified and shown in the data. But we suspect, once we start exploring the bottom of the ocean, we'll see more and more, or other sinks too. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I know I was surprised to hear that part of the earth cores were coming up with plastic. And it's like, oh, what a awkward permanent layer of evidence we're leaving behind. Like, come on, team.
Yeah.
We have Joe, kind of a similar question. Are disposable plastic efforts and disposable as in biodegradable showing any hope of helping to solve this dilemma?
So here's the deal with biodegradable. It only works when it sits in the perfect environment that they're created, right? So if we take a biodegradable plastic and we put it in a sterile landfill, it's going to stay for a very, very long period of time. Do you guys remember Sun Chips? Sun Chips tried to make those bags, right, that were biodegradable, and they didn't last in the economy. Do you guys know why? because they made funny noises, right?
Oh dear.
So yeah, right. And so I think definitely there's still research, it's trying to make the perfect biodegradable plastic that can withstand the needs of its use, right? Without breaking down. But then when it's, disposed of, that'll go away. Think about the plastic spoons from the dining hall, that, I don't know, the University of Washington uses corn-made spoons. They don't work really well in soup, right? But they're supposed to break down and but it's not breaking down in the compost either. That's a big problem. So it's still definitely a technology that needs to be refined quite a bit to be successful. Yeah.
I think the tip to bring your own, like, just kind of, it's exciting that the technology is out there, but yeah, I worry that some of it's kind of that greenwashing where it's like it's still pretty much plastic. So
right, and that's a really
reusables, folks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The only way we can reduce plastic pollution is to stop, is to use less or use none, right? Yeah.
Yeah. If you're thinking of some good holiday gifts this year, reusable menu of options there. Totally. All right, we've got a good question from Elise here. She's tuning in from the Oregon coast. This is so exciting. That's definitely, I think, a highlight of COVID, if that can be a thing, is that that kind of beyond part of our mission of inspiring stewardship really gets to tune in with all sorts of folks. So they're wondering, have you looked at the plastic fiber concentrations specifically from clothing such as polyester, since so many items are now manufactured from synthetics, which is a question I can relate to because I love fleece and I know fleece is a problem. So
no, it's not research that I have done. There's definitely lots of paper out there where people have done, they've collected washing machine water and stuff. So definitely we find, there's tons of papers and people that are doing that. It's work that I'm not doing. Although you saw with, I'm see if I can find that. Where is it? Everything's like lost, but you can see from this picture, and this is definitely a very small, oh my goodness, a very small amount, right? So this is a tangle of fibers, and if this is a millimeter, can you imagine what that whole entire sieve looked like? It'd be crazy. Yeah, it's a lot of work. Yeah.
It makes me think of, I don't know if you get to work with Ken Campbell at all with the Akatsi project, but they did the microplastic study where they started at the source of the Puyallup River, and even in that very first sample, they had a fiber in it. And so kind of disheartening to hear that every single sample they took along the Puyallup River all the way to Commencement Bay had microplastics in it. So you're like, it's everywhere.
Yeah. And that, the stuff when they were up at the glacier, that stuff came from wind. I did a talk on NPR about, they found some up in the Rocky Mountains, on an air filter. It's like, it's everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I mean, just so astounding that like this most pristine, most wild, rural, remote places still have plastic in them, which
that's right. Mm-hmm.
What? Let's see. Okay, we have Crystal, and they're wondering, how long does AstroTurf last in a marine or freshwater environment? I have a feeling this might be a poke at a recent big pollution event, but good question.
Yeah, it's a good idea, right? Let's cover the bottom of the Puyallup River so that it's not so rough with AstroTurf. That was a bad idea. Yeah, it would probably not in the river sediments for long, but definitely, I mean, it's plastic. So definitely once it falls apart. And then I also kind of wondered, if you guys know about ball fields, like there's rubber tires that they put in between the tire bits to try to keep the AstroTurf from stand up. So I wonder, were those in there too? I don't know.
Yeah.
Those poor salmon.
Yes,
yeah, a long time.
Yeah, plastic lasts. Can we say forever? But
not as a scientist, but you can.
Okay, yes.
You're a scientist. No, you can't say it.
It lasts a long stinking time. All right, looking through our comments, we have another question from Joe following up kind of in the vein of thinking about solutions, wondering about how about the microbes that have been identified that can consume plastic? Is that a ray of hope to our plastic problems?
You know, those microbes have been around for a long time. Here's the issue that is a little bit scary. Is, you know, sometimes I think it's ideal, like, oh, well, we can just like create these microbes and we'll throw them in the ocean and then they'll eat all the plastic and then maybe they might eat all the plankton too. So it's a little bit, the geoengineering and the bioengineering is a little bit, yeah, it's tough. But yeah, of course, you know, they've found, is it enough to lessen the impact? I don't know. We've got to turn off the faucet first. We've got to stop putting it in the ocean, and then we can see how effective they are. But yeah, good question, Joe. And great news, you know, which we didn't know, you know, when I first started this project that they existed. Yeah.
That is the extremophiles.
Yes.
Plastic. We have Lynn commenting that she loves that we have a marine debris coordinator. Yeah, that's, yes, I think pretty exciting.
He's either going to love me or hate me when after this.
Yeah, I think it's definitely exciting. There's a lot of, I think, really good collaboration that happens around beach cleanups. I know Harbor WildWatch, we like to team up with the South Sound Surfrider chapter.
Perfect. Yeah.
And they're promoting a lot of solo beach cleanups right now. So
right.
We have a volunteer, Addie, through Harbor WildWatch, and she's been doing a lot of those. And I think at this point has cleaned up over 25 pounds of plastic. So shout out to Addie out there, keeping our beaches clean, and everyone else doing those solo beach cleanups, because
thanks, Addie.
Every little bit matters. Again, I'm still kind of peeking over at the comment section here for more questions. And I have a shout out from Carly Bester. She says, hi, Stina and Julie.
What's up?
Miss you in the hot seat, Carly. That's for sure. So just thinking, just a couple more announcements on my end in case we have some straggling questions coming in. We definitely, you know, we still have some salmon program coming up. So Friday, you can tune in just as you are now through our Facebook live stream to do our Friday fish check out at Minter Creek. We'll have part 2 of our salmon tour at Donkey Creek happening Saturday. And then the following Saturday, the final part of that tour. So those have been really fun, and we've been seeing lots of fish. So again, you know, reduce your plastic use for the salmon.
Indeed.
Clean, clear creeks and estuaries and oceans, you know, the fish that connects it all. It's pretty awesome. And then also just if you'd like to stay tuned for those events, we've started a weekly WildSide newsletter. So it's called the WildSide Weekly, and it has creature features and stewardship tips and all our upcoming events. So if you feel like you're missing out on what Harbor WildWatch is up to, definitely subscribe to our newsletter and we'll keep you in the loop. And for those of you who are in our steward club, big shout out to you all. We will be hosting a little holiday social for the December slot. We again are wrapping up our 2020 Cocktails and Fishtales lineup, but if you're a Steward Club member, you can still come hang out with Harbor WildWatch on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. We'd love to have you. If you're not a Steward Club member, now's the time to get involved, and that fun membership gives you some exclusive digital programs currently, but we do fun tours and good stuff with that group here and there when we can meet in person. So those are a couple of my announcements. I was gonna, of course, Julie, if you have any plugs you'd like to make before we wrap up this evening, feel free to chime on in.
Yeah, well, once we get over this crazy hump, always welcome for folks to come visit or just send me an email at jmasura@uw.edu, and I'm happy to tour up the lab. And yeah, and I'd love to come to some of your beach cleanups when you get a little bit back to it. So yeah, keep me in mind. I'd love to support you. Thank you.
And I know you mentioned you're a wealth of knowledge of all the things. And as I am starting to get together our 2021 Cocktails and Fishtales lineup, for those of you tuning in, if you have any burning questions, subjects you want to learn more about, please email me. You have a presenter in mind or a topic in mind. I'd love to make sure that we're, hitting those things and providing a cool learning opportunity on topics you want to learn about. So you can email me at stina@harborwildwatch.org, and I'd be happy to, try and get this in, because I know Julie and I were talking earlier, like we scheduled this like a year ago, so this has been a long time coming, and
yeah,
we finally made it to the end. So pretty cool, pretty wild. And then my final plug is for any teachers out there. I know it's kind of weird, wild times with digital learning. We just finished our Explore the Estuary virtual field trip. So we have 5 fun video stops that if you have teachers out there, Rachel and I are here to help, and we have some fun ideas for how to do some virtual science-based STEM classroom workshops. So teachers, hit us up, let us know. I'm looking one more time at our questions. Everyone's just lots of thanks, lots of love. It's very cool to hear about your work, and go team on reducing our plastic input. I was like, that's the way to go. So with that, I think I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna end the live stream. So bye, Facebook.
Bye, thanks for having me. Take care.